He has a BS from Union College in New York. He has a JD from the University of Miami, or law degree from University of Miami, and he has an MBA from Harvard. So he is going to talk about profit versus nonprofit, and I think we're all interested in that. We've all had a little bit of experience with both worlds, or most of us have, but it'll be very interesting to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys for coming, and we're delighted to talk to you today. Usually when you go hear a speaker, you're listening to someone who at least professes to have some kind of expertise in something, and that's not really the case here. I came here in 2003 with no nonprofit background. All I had done was for-profit, and so I just had to kind of make it up as I go. So what I'm going to give you is what I see as sort of found, at least in my opinion, of how managing a profit, a for-profit, a nonprofit are similar and different. But the burden is probably on you to be more critical of whether any of the things I say are useful to you, because I'm not an expert. Part of my background after leaving the bank in 1991 was I went into a series of businesses where I went in full-time for a year or two, where an entrepreneur had started a business, got it going, and then typically what happens is usually they're kind of sales-oriented, and that's what makes them successful, but they tend to lose control, and my impression is many of you have probably either been in or helped with situations like this. And so my job was to get things organized so that they could grow further. And so when I came here, I want to give you a little picture. This is what the financial statement. I met Carol in late 2003, and basically asked her out on a date. And a little shortly after that, she brought me by the sanctuary, and trying to impress the person I was courting, I made the mistake of saying, well, maybe I can help. And the result has been 8 years of very long hours.
But I'm sure it was worth it.
It was very well worth it in multiple ways. Thank you for that Valentine's Day thought. Real quick here, now, this is the full year of 2003, which turned out to be the first year that we really had a meaningful financial statement, which we'll talk about. But basically, the first thing I want to do is assess, well, what is the financial condition? In the nonprofit world, profit is called change in net assets. In other words, how much the revenue exceeded the expenses. And it was about $4,000. But if you look here, the capital expenditures were $44,000, so we were really out $40,000. The total cash and investments was $680, but if you look here, there was a life insurance policy that paid off that year for almost $400,000. So the actual amount before that was a couple $100,000. And most of it was illiquid. It was investment properties, rental houses that Carol had donated to the sanctuary. So there was very little cash. In the 11 years before this, the sanctuary had lost money every single year. And when 9/11 came, the visitors stopped, and there weren't that many visitors at the time anyway, but the visitors stopped, donations stopped, and Carol was literally selling household goods out of the house, trying to pay for food for the cats. The next thing I looked at was the financial record keeping. And I'm not an accountant. I don't have an accounting background. I have a finance background. So to me, the issue is having meaningful financial statements that have enough detail and the proper detail, the detail of things you want to know to be able to make decisions. When I got here, Carol's father, I knew, did all of the cage building and maintenance. And I went into what was then the gift shop, which was smaller than this room. And there was a toolbox chained to the desk in like a little cage with a slot in the top, and I thought, man, he must have some really expensive tools. And it turned out that was the accounting system. If somebody walked in and took a tour or bought something in the gift shop or made a donation, it went into the toolbox, and at the end of the day, Carol's father took the toolbox to Carol's mother, and she put it in the bank. So in 2002, all of the revenue was on one line. I had no way to know what was going on. And as you can imagine, the financial statements that were being created were not meaningful. And the third thing I looked at was the operations, and there was some really good news, I felt. There was a very dedicated staff who generally were working well together. Small staff, but really working hard. And they had built up a very active volunteer program, and there were just a large number of people who were coming and volunteering and helping, and that was running well. And the other thing was that they were extremely knowledgeable about the animal care. They knew what they were doing when it came to caring for these animals. So if you kind of envision, each of you envision arriving here in early 2003 and assessing this like I gather you do in other situations, that's what you would have found. So I'm going to try to cover, the best I can, 6 areas of management and how they are similar or different. When it comes to mission, at Citicorp, my last assignment was to do a year-long strategic planning effort for a $20 billion division. And so we went through a very elaborate visioning and mission kind of exercise. And I think they can serve a purpose. They can help people row together and help create a corporate culture. But frankly, I think in most companies, it's often kind of a fuzzy thing. It's not well known to the employees. Most employees can't say what the mission is. If you ask them why we're here, they'll say, to make money. And most importantly, it's not usually the real purpose of the entity. The purpose of a for-profit entity is to make money. It doesn't mean you can't be passionate about building the best car or creating the best advertising or whatever you do, but the primary purpose is to make money. That's what the definition, in my mind, of a for-profit. In a nonprofit, I think it's very different because the mission is absolutely critical. That is your purpose, not making money. That's what defines what your purpose is, and everything else, the strategy and everything else, flows from how you define that. When it comes to strategy, when I think about for-profit businesses, and I try to think about things as simply as I can. It comes down to what businesses are you going to be in, or products, or what services you're going to deliver, and how do you win or compete. Funding tends to be, you may have a funding strategy if you need bank funding or angel funding or whatever, but it's a secondary thing. It's a means to an end. The key things are the strategy focuses on how you're going to get revenue from customers. In a nonprofit, I think the decisions about the services you're going to provide are very similar to deciding what businesses you're going to be in. You're typically, while there are some ways nonprofits compete with each other, that's typically not the focus. It's more focused on how do you maximize the effectiveness of what you're going to do, and you don't have money as a measure. So, and we'll talk about that briefly in a minute. What I think is really different for a nonprofit is that how you're going to fund things becomes critical. It's not secondary, because your revenue does not come from traditionally what's thought of as customers, from delivering your service. If we go back to my list here, when it comes to defining success, well, it's pretty simple in a for-profit. How much money did you make? There may be other metrics like market share and things, but they all are subsets of measurements you make in order to make more money. In a nonprofit, you don't have that bottom line, and so. But I think it is important to try to have quantitative goals, whether it's how many people are cured or how many people are fed, or in our case, one of the metrics is how long the cats live. In the wild, these cats live 10 to 12 years. Here, they often live to 20. And so we track that because that's a quantitative measure of the kind of care we're giving to the cats. Another one is how often we see stressful behavior. There are certain things we can tell that a cat is unhappy. And seeing that rarely, which is what happens here, is an important quantitative measure. And we actually have logs where our people log in cat behavior to track things like that. The one area I think, as I've talked with other small, and when I talk about nonprofits, it's going to be mostly small nonprofits, that I think should be a critical metric of success that I don't perceive being thought of that way is the fundraising. If there isn't enough money, it becomes obvious that you have a problem. But I don't think people see it as a critical part of their defining success. It's sort of a necessary evil. Many don't place value on having reserves that will let you ride through difficult times. And if they raise more, well, they deliver more services. They feed more people, and they don't think about putting any away. And I think that's understandable if you think about the fact that typically the people running the nonprofits, why are they doing this? They're doing this because they have a passion for whatever the cause is. They typically don't have a financial background. They just don't think about it that way. The way I'd suggest thinking about it is if people are donating, if you're working with a nonprofit or running a nonprofit, if people are donating, what does that say about your work? And to me, it's the equivalent of people buying your product because they're validating what you're doing. You're getting people who are saying, I really think what you're doing is important and you're doing it well. So, I tend to equate those, and that filters into some later thinking that I'll share with you. The next area is people management. In a for-profit, you're dealing with employees. And, on the carrot side, the first and foremost thing tends to be the financial remuneration, whether it's salary or commissions or profit sharing. The second one people talk about a lot is job satisfaction, right? Enjoying your work and feeling accomplishment, enjoying being part of the team and being appreciated. In my experience, and yours may be different, but I think that gets talked about a lot more than it gets achieved, and that most companies are not very good about creating job satisfaction, and most managers are not very good at it, but they can get away with it, being mediocre, because people are being paid, depending on how tight or loose the job market is at the time. On the stick side, in a for-profit, you can obviously fire someone if they're not doing a good job, and typically hire someone else because you're paying them. When you get to a nonprofit, you have employees, but the difference is, in a small nonprofit, rarely can you be financially competitive with what people can do in the for-profit world. And so that places an enormously more weight on your ability to create job satisfaction and be a good manager and create a good corporate culture, which seems to be pretty difficult to do generally, given the number of times it gets achieved, I think. The second area is volunteers. Most nonprofits rely heavily on volunteers. Well, there you have no financial carrot, and so it all depends on creating satisfaction and showing appreciation. Now there are times when you have to discipline volunteers, particularly in our environment, like for safety issues or if they're not following your policies or could create a liability. But generally, you're going to have to do it in a very different way. If I walk up to a volunteer here and say, "You do that again, you're out of here," well, you can be pretty sure they're out of there right then. You just can't talk to them that way. Generally, unless they're repeat offenders, and then you get to a point where you don't want them here anymore. So those are the ways I see, in people management, it requires much greater motivational skills than in a for-profit. The next area is the financial reporting. When I went into these businesses that I tried to help position to grow, generally in fact in every case, what I found was that the chart of accounts in their accounting system either came with the software, or is anybody here a tax accountant?
Mm-hmm. Couple of us.
Okay. Or it was, and when I say this, I don't mean to offend any tax accountants, and I'm sure you're different. But you think about it, the accountants who work for small companies can't spend a lot of time because the companies can't afford an awful lot of time. And so they have to do things as quickly as they can in many cases. And their orientation tends to be for tax. And so you can get a chart of accounts that works fine for tax purposes, but doesn't give you the managed information to make decisions. And I had one accountant say to me, "It doesn't matter whether I put this in this category or that category, they're both deductible." Well, that's true for tax purposes, but if I'm trying to track results or make decisions, and one year I put it in this category, and the next year I put it down here, then I can't see the trends. So to me, the key question when you're setting up the chart of accounts is what kind of detail is needed in order to make good decisions. There may be things you don't need detail about. And this is our Big Cat Rescue's financial statement, and it's 4 pages long. And I can go through, and so for instance, just as an example, we have something we call sponsor kits, and we changed them and set them up in the gift shop, and we just weren't getting the increase that I thought we should. And so we sat down and talked about it and said, why not? We wouldn't have had that conversation if we weren't tracking specifically, if they were just lumped in with donations. And we looked at the way they were displayed in the gift shop and said, and we talked to the people in the gift shop about what were they seeing as people walked through. And we felt that the display was not clear enough and effective enough and appealing enough. And so we all sat down and changed it. And sponsorship sales have risen in the gift shop as a result. So, if we couldn't track it, I wouldn't know that. And if we weren't tracking it, I wouldn't have known to address it as a concern. So I think that is, to me, a truth in both the for-profit and the nonprofit world. There are 2 areas that I think are different on the financial side. One is audited financial statements. Most small companies, in my experience, do not have audited financial statements, and they don't need them unless a financial institution is requiring it. And most financial institutions that deal with small companies realize it's not very practical for a small company to have an audited financial statement. In the nonprofit world, there are 2 issues. One is that this is a source of credibility with donors. It's a big marketing issue to have audited financial statements. And the second is that it's a requirement of some kinds of donations, particularly of grants from larger institutions. The second area is your tax return. In a small for-profit, the concern is how much taxes, how little taxes can I pay? And you give your financial statements to your tax accountant, hoping that they will do the best job they can of keeping the taxes low. But you're not very involved in that process. There may be some questions, but it's pretty much up to the accountant to do that. In the nonprofit world, the IRS Form 990 is not about paying taxes. It's a marketing tool. It's what particularly sophisticated donors look at to decide if you're credible and if you're an organization they want to donate to. And there's a lot of non-financial information in it. And so I believe, and we spend a lot of time on our 990 to make it as appealing and informative as we can. If any of you are trying to help some nonprofits, particularly in donating time, those of you who have these skills, our audit and 990 cost is about 1/3 of what it is normally. And the reason is that I'm able to hand it to our accountant on a platter. I've got the 990 done. I've got what I think the audited financial statement should look like in a way that makes it very easy for her to go through. And she has to check my work. She does the full audit, but she's not starting from a box of receipts, which I'm sure at some point you've gotten from some client. So that's a way you can really help cut costs, and not only help cut costs, to the extent they weren't capable of having an audited financial statement, and you reduce the cost that they can, you've now created a marketing tool. The last category here, the other issue in nonprofit is the critical ratios. Again, from a marketing standpoint, are your fundraising and administrative cost. And this is what donors look at. If they look and see that half of what they donate to you goes to overhead, that's not very attractive. If it's under 33%, 35%, that's good. If it gets down to 20%, that's rare and excellent. So then we get to the marketing side. And here, I'm just going to show you how I thought about this, and then later we'll talk about what we did. But I made this little chart. And basically, I start with 2 simple questions. Who's the customer and what are you selling?
And over on the for-profit side, you may have a source of capital, your bank or something else, but basically, this is what happens. You've got a product or service you're delivering. There's a person who receives it, and that's where the revenue comes from. So it becomes pretty obvious who's the customer. You have this kind of weird situation in a nonprofit where in most cases, the service you're delivering to some recipient, but your revenue comes from somebody else, the donor. And so what I would argue to you is the answer to this who is the customer question is the customer is whoever the revenue comes from. And in this case, it's the donor. And so that's how we view donors, just like you would a customer.
And if you accept that, then everything you all know about how you treat customers immediately applies to your donors. Then the question is, okay, well, wait a minute now. If the donor is the customer, what are we selling? Anybody want to try to answer that one for me? What I came up with is, look, we're selling satisfaction. We're selling feeling good about the fact that whatever it is that you're donating to has now become a part of your life's accomplishment, your life's legacy. And so, what do I got here? And you know, there are people who donate because of guilt or because of some sense of obligation to something or someone. You know, there's arm twisting. You know, I donated to your cause, you donate to mine.
And the wife just likes writing checks.
Yeah.
The interesting you don't have up there is the write-off, tax write-off.
You're right. I probably, you know, that does motivate people, and I should probably add it.
But it doesn't.
But it tells you something that
it doesn't motivate them to donate to you instead of some other nonprofit.
Right. They get that across the board. But you know, I just took the position as I thought about how to go about this that these aren't reasons that people buy products in the for-profit world. Typically, I mean, you may buy your wife a present out of guilt or your husband a present, but and so I didn't think they should be why we do it in the nonprofit, and that it should be selling this satisfaction. Now, there within the concepts of how to treat customers, and again, I'm no expert at this, and it would be a huge topic, but there are two concepts that I kind of picked up and adopted over the years that I think are important and applied for us here. One is, and there are studies to this effect, that it's easier and cheaper to retain a customer than to acquire a new one. And so while you should be acquiring customers, your primary focus should be on retaining your existing ones. And so we do that with personal attention and trying to find ways to show appreciation, figuring out what your customers' interests are so that what you present to them appeals to their interests. So, you know, we have donors who it's very important to them to get their name on something. They really like that. That's great, because if I know that, I know what to present to them. And if we come up with something new that you put your name on, I know to go to them. We have other donors who really like our advocacy work, which I will talk about very briefly later. But basically, that's the part of our work where we're trying to change the regulations, change the laws to improve the lives of many more cats. And so with those, you know, when we have the next meeting with USDA about stopping cub petting, well, I send them a report on that because I know that's what interests them. So, you know, that's very basic marketing. When it comes to acquiring customers, I once took a sales course, and one thing that struck me in it is they were very big on not wasting your time on bad prospects. You know, find people who really want or need your service. Don't bash your head against the wall. How many of you have a salesman who you've politely told, I'm not your customer, and they just keep at you because they learned to overcome objections? And, you know, Carol and I, a few years ago, probably 3-4 years ago now, had the occasion at another nonprofit's function to sit next to one of the wealthiest philanthropists in town and his wife. Absolutely fascinating guy, multiple serial entrepreneur. We really hit it off. But when he asked what we did, and I told him, and I always say, you know, love to have you out, I could just tell that I was getting a polite answer. That, you know, it really wasn't his interest. I looked up what he donates to, and it tended to be the orchestra and certain other things. And so we've never asked this man for a penny. We've seen him 4 or 5 times. He's cheerful and happy. He's probably cheerful and happy because we're the only people who don't ask him for money. But, another lesson that I really learned the hard way was that major corporations are just not our market. They're great for the American Cancer Society, and you know, you never know when you have a strategy and implementation, if it fails, which one failed. You know, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I just did it poorly. But you know, I went to the trouble. We had an ad agency volunteer time, and I made up this really cool thing that, you know, all those in favor of big cat corporate sponsorship, and we do have some corporate sponsorships, but they don't tend to be the huge companies because animals just don't seem to play well going through the corporate improvement process. Now, if I have a business owner, that's a whole other story because that's like an individual, and we do very well with individual business owners who have a passion for animals, and they don't need this kind of presentation. One of the beauties of the social networking, which we focus very heavily on, is that it kind of self-selects people who are interested. You know, people who don't care animals don't friend us on Facebook. So that's been very helpful. I want to kind of illustrate this point. I want to play you a very short 2-minute video.
The 8-week-old cub I got to pet was obviously sick and barely moved during our visit.
Why do you think he's sick?
Maybe he's just tired and he's just maybe stressed about something.
Another cub on display was missing a patch of fur and clearly not happy to have its photo taken.
Oh my gosh, what's wrong with his fur?
His brother was chewing on him.
I'll be daggone.
It's sleeping? Oh my god, it looks like it's dead.
No, so one hand per group.
Do we need to check in over there?
Come here, Cook.
Oh, he's not very happy. 2 weeks old.
What do I keep hearing them moving?
That's what happened yesterday. There's blood everywhere.
This employee told us he got scratched up by one of these older tigers just the day before.
It was just a total mess.
Now, how old is this one?
He's about 15 weeks.
15.
The other two are over there underneath the porch. One of them's a week older than him,
and
the other one is a month older than him.
Fighting is all about teething.
This is just milk?
This guy's about 13 weeks old. This is one of our now famous swimming tigers. Tigers do love the water. They actually have a little webbing in their paws.
Right, a little later on, I will be swimming with tigers. As if this weren't dangerous enough, I'll be swimming with tigers, which is a feature now you have for people, right?
Right, yep. You'll be jumping in the water with this guy.
Television variety and talk shows.
6 is about 5 months old. That's Grace. Grace there's about 6 or 7 months old.
No, she got bit by one of them a while ago, so.
Yeah. We do. We got some little bitty ones in the house. They're extremely limited on who gets to go see them.
Yeah.
Because their immune system hasn't kicked in yet.
Yeah.
So we don't.
Did I get to go because she got bit?
That's the only reason she's.
How old are these guys?
3 weeks.
They cannot retract their nails when they're first born because it's their only defense mechanism.
Yeah, these are just 3 days old.
3 days old.
Yep.
It'll be 38 days. My
This little guy right here is actually 2 weeks old. His eyes actually opened within 2 days. You can't pet him. You're not going to hurt him. I got this guy healthy, and he's going to make it just fine. Go ahead and take him back. Take him back, but he's missing.
The point I'm trying to make is, if you look at this video, and this is, some people may be able to look at this and say, gee, that shouldn't be, or I don't, but that's not something that I want to be involved in. There are other people who look at this video and their eyes water and say, that's awful, they get mad, they want that to stop. From a marketing standpoint, not wasting time on bad prospects, I don't want to spend time on the person who thinks, oh, that shouldn't be, but that's not my interest. The person whose eyes water and who groans and say, oh my, that's someone. But I don't want to talk to that person about a donation. I want to talk to that person about stopping that be part of their life. And donating is one way that they can help. I'm going to finish up by just skimming through how I tried to take this stuff and apply it to Big Cat Rescue over the last 8 years. In terms of our mission, and I didn't write out the mission statement here, but basically it's in 2 parts. Caring, the best care we can give to the cats, and secondly, stopping this kind of abuse and abandonment. There's thousands of these tigers bred to be cubs for cub petting to make money and then stuck in a box, and we don't have time to discuss that today. But trying to solve the problem so that cats don't need to be rescued. Now, this second part of this mission is critical. Remember I said that everything flows from the mission. If our mission were the first part, or were slightly altered to be give the best care and rescue as many cats as we possibly can, we would have a much different strategy and everything else that flows from that here. The fact that this second part is part of our mission had a critical impact on the strategy. And so there were a couple things as I thought through this from the beginning. One is, we have about 120 cats. We could have 50 more cats, and it wouldn't put a dent in the problem, and it would make the fundraising treadmill go faster and faster, and we'd never get time to work on the second thing. The second thing was that our first responsibility is to ensure that we can meet our commitment to these cats. Now, there are some nonprofits where you work in an environment where, you can cut back what you do, you can stop. When we take in a tiger, it costs us about $10,000 a year to feed and give medical care to a tiger. They can live to 20. So when we've at times taken in 4 tigers or lions at once, who were around 10 years old, and they could live to 20, we just made a $400,000 future commitment. So one of the things I did early on was kind of back of the envelope, try to do the math and say, look, if there's another 9/11 and visitors don't come and donors don't donate, how much money would we have to have in the bank to meet this future commitment? It's kind of like in the corporate world, you think about pension liability, right? What do you think that number would be? You have no basis for guessing, but give me a guess. How much would it take to feed all these cats to the end of their lives? Just throw something out there.
$2 million.
Close? Yep. I came up with $5 million. And so that's what we set as our target for building reserves, which, you saw the financial statement, pretty darn ambitious for a nonprofit of this size. And then we made a couple of decisions, 3 decisions really, that went into this strategy. We said we were going to cap the number of animals. We would take in animals as we lost them and not grow the number of animals for the reason that I said. There are many nonprofit or many sanctuaries or people who call themselves sanctuaries who make the mistake that rescues generate donations because they're exciting. They never generate anywhere near enough to pay the future cost. So today's expenses get paid for by the money that comes in from a rescue, but the obligation gets bigger and bigger. It's like a reverse Ponzi scheme. And we just had a 400 animal facility in Texas go bankrupt last year, and it took a year to place all those animals, and now everybody else is full. The second decision we made was to build these reserves, one, to ensure the commitment to the animals that I've already talked about, and the other was to have the resources to be able to focus any time or energy on the second part of the mission. I'm pointing here, I should point there. And the third was to keep our fundraising administrative expenses low, both from a cost control standpoint and also from a marketing standpoint. And so when I then started, okay, what am I going to now do? Well, to me, our tour business, with people come and take tours, that was the easiest thing for me to focus on because it was more like the for-profit world. And so I knew something about that. I knew nothing about donations or how to get donations. And so we started working on that. And back in 2003, nobody I knew had heard of the place, and we had a little under 12,000 visitors, and we were charging $15. And pricing strategy became another part of this. And so we built it up in 2004 to 18,000, and then it grew, and then as the recession hit, it kind of tapered off, and then in 2011, it actually jumped up a little bit, about 9% to 28,000. But basically, we doubled it in this time, and along the way, found that we could raise prices so that the revenue came from under $200,000 to $500,000. And then right about in here, after spending most of my time this way, we started focusing much more on donations, which was a real learning process for me, kind of trial and error. And I'm just going to skim through things because of our time constraint here, but we have regularly reevaluated our donation options, just like you would your product offerings in a for-profit, what the choices are, how they're presented. We've come up with new and better ways to recognize our donors. During this period of time, I didn't feel we could spend money hiring a person. And so our donation effort was mostly half of my time. It got to the point where as it succeeded, I couldn't handle it. But as I asked around and went to meetings where there were other nonprofit people, and I would ask executive directors, almost always they were very unhappy with their person. The person who raises money in a nonprofit organization is normally called what? Fundraiser, or what was it? Development. So they call it development director often as a title. And what I learned asking questions was that if you choose development as a career and you go to a small nonprofit, the only place for you to advance is to go to a bigger nonprofit. And so you come to a small, if you're any good, in 2 to 3 years, you leave and go to a bigger one, and if you're not good, you don't perform and typically get recycled to some other small nonprofit who has put X years of experience on their criteria. And I talked to one executive director who, after years of frustration, somebody in her organization said, well, what about so-and-so? And so-and-so had been there 10 years on staff, never done fundraising, but she thought, she has those qualities, and it worked out very well. So this wasn't my idea. I got this aha moment from her, and so we hired one of our volunteers to be our development director. And it's a person who has a passion for our cause, isn't looking for their next development job. I've done, tried to do a lot of things to make sure this person is happy, and he's doing a good job. But I think our chances of him staying long-term, developing relationships, I've heard people say in the nonprofit world, well, the donor's affiliation should be with your cause, not with a person. Well, any person who does sales knows that there's a personal element in sales, and the development work is sales. So having your salesperson turn over all the time is not optimal if you want to increase sales. We send handwritten thank you notes. He sends notes to everyone above a certain fairly modest level of donation. At a little higher level, I sit down in the evenings and write personal thank you notes, handwritten to them. We try to have touch points that are not asking for money. So if a person's interested in something, whether it's something happening about a cat, each contact is not all asking money, that we're engaging them without that. And so what ended up happening with the donations is in 2003 it was $120,000, and in 2010 it was over $1 million. Now this, in fairness, was a rather extraordinary year because we got one large donation for like $220,000, but it was still up from 2009. A big part of this, which we don't have time to talk about, is our social network, in which our cause lends itself in a way that some others may not. YouTube videos and things like that. So as we had positive cash flow, basically I split it up three ways. One was for capital expenditures, buildings, and we twice bought additional land, and we bought a backup generator for our freezers because at our risk in a hurricane, the cats are pretty well safe. But if we run out of food, we feed 500 pounds of raw meat a day. We can't run down to Publix and fill in if there's a hurricane. The second area was to invest in things that would increase donations. And so, back in 2003, we had this horrible donor software, but it was all we could afford. As we could afford it, we bought, the top of the line donor software, which has been very helpful. We invested in a person whose major responsibility here is to make videos. YouTube has now started doing this differently, but they were rating nonprofits on YouTube by their cumulative views, and we were regularly the 6th, 7th, or 8th in the world in YouTube views on our videos. And that has created donations. We've got a lot of stuff that's ended up on Animal Planet, not from our YouTube videos, but from other productions, and donors have come to us that way and heard about us that way. And then the whole social networking and website thing we've invested in heavily. And the third was to build these reserves. So what was the outcome of all this? This is the financial statement. We went from 4,000 and changing net assets to 176 to 300 to over $500,000 last year. Again, it was extraordinary. This year, because of two increases in expenses, one of which we couldn't control, which is meat prices skyrocketed on us, and the other we could, which was devoting more money to our advocacy work. Our bottom line will probably be back in the $400,000 to $500,000 range. In the meantime, our reserves went from the $680 you saw in 2003 to $3.3 million. And so we are marching toward that $5 million goal. And in 2011, and sort of the end of 2010, or last half, we have finally, as we've focused on building up the financial capacity, been able to spend a lot more time on the advocacy work, trying to change the regulations. We are suing one of the guy who was mentioned in here with the Cubs, who had 23 Cubs die. We're in a federal lawsuit with him. Very expensive, but we're in a position where we can do that. 5 years ago, we couldn't have done that. That would be a whole other 40-minute talk. So I hope you're not all sound asleep at this point, but that's that's my experience with trying to take a for-profit background and apply it to a nonprofit. And I hope you come away with something helpful out of that.